So for folks who are joining today, right now, for the housing workshop, where we're going to talk about policy and we're going to talk about messaging and we're going to practice lobbying. Thank you for being here. My name is Sam. I use she, her pronouns, and I am on the political education team and I'll be presenting and facilitating parts of the workshop today. Sami Ahmad, who is my coworker, well, my teammate specifically on political ed, will also be joining facilitation in the messaging component. And I'm going to be sharing some similar slides for folks who were on the possibilities not punishment workshop just the hour beforehand. So you'll be seeing some duplicate slides, but we're really going to have a big bulk of the conversation be leaning towards housing, where Genevieve Rand, who is here, our statewide organizer for housing justice, will take that on in just a few minutes. So for folks who are here, either if you've been here for the last workshop or you're just joining, please put your name, pronouns, location, and why you're here into the chat, just kind of so we can get oriented into the room and shift gears a little bit. Are folks able to share into the chat? All right, I see. Thank you, Jake. Albany, Jen says Ithaca. I'm so amped about the people who are staying for this issue as well as the last issue. Hi, Darlene. Yes, here again, Gwen. Love it. Andrea, thank you for being here. Sabah, thank you for being here. We're going to move it again. I'm probably just going to jump us right in right now, so we're not late, as late as we were in the last one. So I'm going to share my screen for the majority of this workshop. As you need anything, please raise your hand, use the chat, do whatever is most comfortable for you to communicate any thoughts or questions. Where there's also a lot of opening space for questions. And at the end of this, we're going to practice lobbying. Before we get into anything, I'm going to reiterate the community agreements that we go over during workshops within spaces at Citizen Action. So for folks who again heard this already, again, just give a thumbs up afterwards. I'll ask for consensus and make sure everybody's comfortable with these community agreements before we move forward. And hi, Dazaria, nice to see you. Well, and have you here. Okay, so the slides that are up right now are some community agreements. If you have ones that you would like to add, please put them in the chat where you can say them out loud right afterwards. And I'm just going to ask for consensus and thumbs up, like I said, after I read these. So everyone participates, no one dominates, is to ensure that everyone has a chance to be heard and share their ideas. Land the plane is to ensure that everybody's story has a beginning, middle, and end, and we're not going on a tangent, right? We want to be honoring the time that we have today, and it is a short amount of time, so we are gonna move a little bit quickly. Keep it to the I, because statements from your perspective are the only statements that you can share, right? Like we can only speak from our own perspective. So please refrain from generalizing groups. Stories stay, lessons leave. That just essentially means that if folks share their story here, it is nobody else's business to take that story out of this space and share personal detail. The lesson that you take from a story is something that you can move forward when we leave this space. Progressive stack, at Citizen Action, our stack is always progressive. So if there are several people raising their hands or in the chat saying they have questions, we use a progressive stack to make sure that we're listening to voices that aren't often heard first in a white supremacist patriarchy, right? So we want to hear like Black voices, uplift queer voices, femme voices, and so on. So like I said, our stack is always progressive within Citizen Action. And as facilitators, myself, I'll take that on as a responsibility to make sure that the stack is progressive. Are these okay? And do folks have any additions or things they'd like to share before we move forward? I saw a thumb up from John. I appreciate it. I love feedback. Okay. So we're here. I'm not going to go through theory of change as much, but really we're here to make sure that we move our justice agenda forward. And because we are currently in this moment of time in the year where it is the legislative session, right? There are legislators from all over the state working from January to June to pass legislation. And we want to make sure that the legislation that's passed reflects our values and our justice agenda, right? To make sure everybody's basic needs are met, that people can thrive and feel safe in their homes and in their communities and have access to the things that they need to thrive, right? To make sure that they have a safe house over their head that's stable and that they know they can return to the next day, right? To make sure that they're connected with family and they're not going to be pushed into incarceration because they're a young Black student being reprimanded and expelled in schools, right? We want to make sure that we have clean water, clean air for folks to breathe so we can continue to live a healthy life with the people that we love, right? And we're fighting for those values during this legislative session. So that's why we're here to discuss how we're going to be lobbying. So when Genevieve moves forward with talking about policy, Sami is then going to talk about messaging our value system and how we add both of those together to move a legislator with our demands, right? When we lobby, we're a force of people coming together, organized, with demands that legislators cannot ignore, right? We're going in person, showing up, and we're telling them what we want for our communities, because community members, right? We all know what's best for us, right? We don't need other folks speaking for us. Our voices coming together share the story that we believe in, right? Share our narrative and our thoughts and our feelings around justice and around what safety can look like. So we are taking that into our own voices, into our own hands, and we're moving it through the legislators. So we're going to be practicing, again, like I said, later on, how we're going to use our voices in the lobbying session. When we lobby, when you go in, for folks who haven't lobbied before, you're going to be meeting with a legislator and or their staff, and they're going to ask you a series of questions, and there's going to be conversation, right? And when you're in that space, you're part of that lobbying team, right? Everybody who's showing up with you from Citizen Action or for Housing Justice in that space is a part of that team. So playing off of each other's words and stories and encouraging each other to speak up is an incredible way to show the organized force that we are, right? And it's also really important to recognize that sometimes you'll meet with the legislator, like I said, other times it may be with staff, but there's no reason to think that just because it's a staff member, that it's not as important of a conversation, right? The time that we're using is really valuable, right? So, and no one person can really move legislation forward, meaning that the legislator staff can influence them and can move them to do what we want them to do, right? So remember that your voice is important, and don't let any situation kind of falter you, because when we're in that together, when we're in those spaces together, it's really powerful. So no further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Genevieve, let her move us through the policy agenda for housing justice, and then we'll move forward with the program.
Hello, everybody. So I'm going to start by telling you about the bills that we have and about the landscape that they're sitting on in the New York State Legislature. Hearing about bills talked at you for several minutes at a time can be really boring. So I'm going to try to put these in context of what people actually experience as tenants, what I've experienced as a tenant. I've had evictions in my past that multiple of these bills could have actually prevented. So as a top line message, we at Citizen Action believe that everyone deserves guaranteed housing that's safe. Wow, my phone just rang. I'm so sorry. That's safe and dignified, regardless of their income or social status. COVID-19 and the resulting economic crisis have exposed and worsened like serious inequality and precariousness that did already exist in the housing policies of New York State. Due to the lack of access to safe and affordable housing across our state before the pandemic, tenants who owe billions of dollars in back rent have experienced greater levels of displacement and homelessness. So we need solutions that provide relief to those with the least resources, not those with the most. The first of those, and our top line bill that many of you may have heard of before, is called Good Cause Eviction Protections. So this bill is Citizen Action along with the Housing Justice for All Coalition, which is over 80 tenant organizations and housing advocacy groups across the state, supports building into our state budget legislation to end no-fault evictions. Oh my God, there's so much noise happening in my house. I'm so sorry. Someone just knocked on my door and our dog is going crazy. So good cause eviction bans no-fault evictions. A no-fault eviction is when you've paid your rent, you've followed your lease, and yet your landlord decides to evict you anyway. This happens all the time. There are probably people in this room who have wanted to stay in a home, but have been told by their landlord, I'm not going to renew your lease this year, or I'm going to raise your rent so much that you can't afford to live here anymore. Passing good cause would ensure that tenants are no longer evicted in retaliation for opposing unsafe living conditions, organizing with other tenants, or to displace current tenants to gentrify neighborhoods by selling buildings, knocking them down, making them more expensive. The bill also has a way to prevent unreasonable rent hikes and allow us to challenge them in court in recognition of the fact that what these giant rent hikes actually are a mechanism to displace low and moderate income tenants. Good cause has already passed in cities like Albany, Kingston, Newburgh, and Poughkeepsie, but lawsuits from the real estate industry are threatening the ability of local like municipalities to pass and enforce these bills. But what we do know is that there is no legal argument against states passing these bills. And our next door neighbor, New Jersey, has had good cause eviction for about 50 years. And I've talked to many tenants from New Jersey who have told me, I would not have the apartment I live in today if it were not for these protections. Our second bill is called the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act. So as again, many people here may know, and as I've experienced personally, the sale or foreclosure or demolition of rental buildings is really destabilizing for individual tenants and whole communities. Sometimes a whole community can live in one or two buildings on a single development. In response, we are trying to pass a bill that will make it so New York gives residents the first opportunity to purchase a rental building that goes up for sale or decide who that building is going to be sold to. If we don't want to buy it ourselves, then we can decide who buys it. Legislation similar to TOPA has been enacted in Washington, D.C. and San Francisco, and that's empowered tenants to create permanently affordable housing. In Washington, D.C., there's over 4,000 units across the city, which is much smaller than the state of New York, that have been permanently affordable for many, many years because they've had TOPA since, I believe, the mid-80s. With this, tenants have been able to create, permanently affordable housing. They're able to keep communities together and stabilize them against the patterns of disinvestment and gentrification that are driven by a private profit-seeking market. And tenants are able to purchase their buildings and have a equity stake, build wealth that they can pass on to their children. And that money comes from, in the case of New York, what we're asking for, a $250 million per year allocation to helping tenants buy our own buildings. Third bill is the Housing Access Voucher Program. This one's easy. It's Section 8 vouchers, but the state will fund some of them because right now, as anyone who's applied for Section 8 knows, there's a really long waiting list. It's really hard to get the vouchers. If we free up a few $100 million in the state of New York, we could move through those wait lists, get a lot of people vouchers for like an affordability basis, or if they're currently homeless. Additionally, HAVP would allow undocumented New Yorkers to apply for Section 8 vouchers, which is currently not true. The federal Section 8 program is successful at what it does because when it's able to do it and people are able to get the vouchers, because it meets households where they're at. As incomes rise and fall, the tenant's share of the rent rises and falls, but Section 8 vouchers make sure that it stays affordable proportional to what a tenant makes. There's two more. One is addressing the lead crisis upstate. This is a large and complicated and multi-year issue, but a big problem that we have is that outside of New York City, there's no uniform mechanisms governing property inspections by municipalities for lead. There's nothing that requires compliance. And this means that New York has the worst rates of childhood lead poisoning of any state in the country. And there are many cities, particularly upstate, where we have the highest level of lead in children's blood anywhere in the United States. So we're supporting the Childhood Lead Poisoning and Prevention and Safe Housing Act that will ensure that all properties are inspected for lead at all points of exposure and will create mechanisms for property owners to remediate lead in buildings. It'll also create a public database. It'll help us manage lead like it's a serious health problem, which it is, instead of kicking the can down the line over and over and not spending the money the federal government has given us to address this problem, which is what we've been doing. Finally, we have right to counsel for tenants who are in eviction courts. We support the right to counsel legislation, which will expand New York City tenant protections to tenants statewide. In New York City, tenants are given a right to legal counsel in court. However, in upstate New York, about 97% of tenants go unrepresented, whereas about 97% of landlords are represented by a lawyer. As anyone who's ever been to court knows, if you don't have a lawyer and the person who's going against you does, your case is basically already decided for you. Under this legislation, tenants would be represented throughout the entire case, including legal advice and advocacy and assistance even before court. The state would be required to contract with nonprofit legal service providers, many of which we already have in our areas, but don't have sufficient funding to provide services for every single tenant. Access to legal services. This is like a crazy statistic that I think a lot of people don't realize when they're talking about right to counsel as a sort of, it seems like kind of a boring thing. It's not exactly changing the law. It's just giving lawyers to enforce it, but it definitely changes how eviction cases go. Access to legal representation in eviction proceedings means that 86% of tenants who've had a right to counsel in New York City have been able to stay in their homes and beat their cases. And 7 other cities with right to counsel provisions around the country have seen up to 77% reductions in evictions. The misapplication of the law in housing court is a huge problem, and passing right to counsel will make sure that any other law that we pass, like good cause, is properly enforced, and that way more tenants than are able to now are able to stay in our homes.
Do folks have questions or any clarification points for Genevieve before we move?
I want to note what somebody said in the chat about New York City's right to counsel being overwhelmed. That is absolutely true. And it is all the more reason that we need a state level program with state level funding to facilitate the right to counsel in all municipalities, because leaving it up to a city by city, my city's passed it, but our system's overwhelmed too, because cities don't have the kind of money to throw around that the state does. And every tenant deserves a lawyer. We send people to criminal court and we say that they have a right to legal representation because going to prison is very, very serious. But we send people to housing court, and as of right now, we don't get a right to representation, even though losing your home is very, very serious. I see someone with their hand up.
Yeah, so I was wondering, what would that structure of the program that you're talking, that you would think would help, what would that look like to you?
Of right to counsel?
Yeah.
It would look like basically an expansion of the programs that already exist. Most especially major municipalities, have a like tenant legal aid service in them, but don't have the funding or the staff to provide like legal aid assistance to all of the tenants. So I think maybe what you're getting at is that there's a decision point between like the way that it works in criminal court, where there are public defenders that are hired and managed and employed by the state. That is not what New York's current right to counsel proposal is. It is an expansion of the funding of contracts with private legal aid assistance institutions. Where I live, it's called Legal Assistance of Western New York. In New York City, it's Legal Aid Society. It's different in different places, but it would be funding these institutions in the places that already have them with government contracts and expand and like creating funding to create new ones in places that don't.
Okay, thank you. That answered my question. Yeah.
Yeah, just so folks who maybe aren't looking at the chat, Darlene had asked, was the lead bill something that, you know, our legislative director, Rebecca, was working on with folks, and Jen said yes. Genevieve replied yes. It was in the making for a while, and it's now something that's on the forefront and to be something that can be passed. It is really like organizing, coming together to build legislation and move it forward. Other thoughts or questions before, Jen, are you going to move to the landscape? Yeah, any other questions beforehand? Margaret, go ahead.
So all of these bills would have to be in the budget. Is good cause, does that require funding through the budget as well?
Great question, Margaret. Perfect segue for me to talk about the current landscape. So Sam, have we already shown the legislative cycle graph in this presentation yet?
We have, but I can go back if you'd like.
I would like for you to go back to it to answer this question, because it really informs everything else that I'm going to ask of you guys. So New York is making laws between January and July. The first half of that is the budget session. So this is going to get a little complicated, but bear with me. New York has a really bad housing situation. In some cities, the price of apartments have gone up on average 45% over the past year or two. And after what I'm sure is to all of us, a scary swing in the rightward direction in the midterms last year, that was basically unique in the United States, except for Florida, I think, which is not a great comparison to make. The Democrats in the state of New York have realized, oh my God, we should probably do something to help the people who live in our state so that they have a reason to go and vote for us. As a result of this, they've decided we're going to talk about housing at the top of our legislative agenda. And so when Kathy Hochul, the governor of New York, put out her legislative agenda for this year, she's like, housing was one of the first things that she talked about, but all she talked about was changing zoning laws to build more housing in places that are underdeveloped right now. Which, you know, changing zoning laws to allow apartment buildings in previously like suburban enclaves is a good thing to do. However, building housing takes a very long time, and building that new housing isn't going to address the power imbalance between landlords and tenants that allows discriminatory and retaliatory evictions. It doesn't address the issue of landlords being able to raise rents to whatever they want. There are a lot of other pieces to this puzzle. But Kathy Hochul has said, I'm working on housing this year. Here's what I want to do. Luckily for us, because we're a pretty progressive state, a lot of people in New York State's legislature have looked at Kathy Hochul's plan and have said, this isn't enough for us. If we're going to work on housing, we need more than just building more housing in some suburbs. We have people who are in, you know, urban areas, and people who have lead poisoning in their homes and so on and so forth, who have problems that also need solving. We want to see more here. We want to see investments in housing affordability like HAVP. We want to see tenant protections that stop evictions like Good Cause. And so Kathy Hochul needs to do some things, needs to flex some muscles or purchase some political support in order to pass the plan that she wants to pass. Her plan is going to be up to pass in the New York State budget. Even though some of the stuff in it isn't totally budgetary, this stuff gets messy in our government sometimes. Sometimes we pass things that aren't budget during the budget season, and that's just how it is because they're in packages with budget stuff. And it's our belief that because we are pushing a very like strong pro-tenant housing agenda that the real estate industry really, really doesn't like, that they are going to fight us on it and prevent moderate legislators from supporting it unless they're able to package it with something that's a little more friendly to people who maybe wouldn't support tenant protections on their own, like the Building More Housing plan that Kathy Hochul is putting forward. So she has an interest in creating a legislative package with us, and we have an interest in creating one with her. However, this only works if we pass them at the same time, which is in the state budget. It's not the only way for us to win, but we strongly believe that this is the best way for us to win. And if we want to win that, we have a month and a half to do it. Luckily, this is possible because many of these bills have been worked on for years by organized tenants around the state of New York. I'm sure many of you who this is not your first citizen action policy like education session have heard about Good Cause, HAVP, TOPA, and so on before. We've done a lot of work as an organization and within a statewide coalition to push legislators to support these bills over the course of years. We have more support than ever this year. We have the bills ready we have enough sponsors to pass them through all the committees we need to pass them through, which is probably going to happen by the end of this month. And so now is the time for us to go as hard as we can to move them across the finish line and make sure that they don't get negotiated down to weaker versions that don't help us the ways that we need. So, Sam, if you could go back to the other slide. This is where we need to get active. Like I said, several of these bills are moving, and I have some asks at the end of this, some links I want you guys to click on to join us. Yeah, to see which politicians we need to target. There's unfortunately hundreds of politicians in the state of New York, and I don't have time to go through who we need to target in this meeting, but I guarantee you that no matter which city you live in, there are representatives at your state level who you can work with me and with others in Citizen Action to move in a good direction to pass the bills that we need to pass. And I'll have a little sign up at the end where you can say what city you're in and what you're interested in doing together. And I and others will reach out to you and we'll make a plan together to get these bills across the finish line, protect tenants, invest in housing affordability, help people buy their own apartments from landlords that neglect them, and more.
Any other questions or thoughts? There was a question higher up. Maybe it was answered. Bev had asked, is there a projected cost for what the right to counsel bill would cost? I don't know if you answered that. I'm sorry if you did.
There is a specific budget ask. I don't remember exactly what it is. I think with that and with all of our bills, it's like you can look up New York State Right to Counsel, and like there's a whole thing called Right to Counsel Coalition, which we're a part of, and that has all the details of the bill. But in reality, like these bills cost what they cost, and like people need representation in court when the consequences for losing a case could be very serious to them. And we as a state need to meet those costs. And if we, for some reason, like reach a point where we think that we don't have enough money, we have a lot of people in the state who are extremely, extremely wealthy, who are making that money off of the backs of much less wealthy New Yorkers. And so we need to tax the very, very wealthy and redistribute their wealth to make these programs possible. And so also this year, along with many other progressive organizations, we're supporting a Tax the Rich campaign and an Invest in Our New York campaign to make sure that New York's ultra wealthy are contributing their fair share to make these programs possible. Summer has a question.
Yeah, real quick, with the Good Cause eviction, You mentioned people with leases. If you don't have a lease, does this bill cover you?
That's a fantastic question, Summer. If you are living in an apartment and paying rent, even if you don't have a written lease, you do have a lease. And this gets a little in the weeds, but it's called, if a landlord accepts rent from you in exchange for living in a unit of housing, if you don't have a written lease, you have what's called a de facto lease. And if you sign like a 1-year lease and then it gets to the end and your landlord doesn't give you a new one to sign, but they keep accepting rent, you have a de facto month-to-month extended lease as long as the landlord keeps accepting rent. So yes, this bill protects tenants who don't have a written lease signed, because under the law, you actually do have what's known as a de facto or a verbal or whatever lease. Anyone who pays rent to live in an apartment, according to the law, by default does have a lease. So yes, this protects everyone. And that is a really important question to include, because a lot of people, especially like where I live and in many parts of upstate, and this happens downstate too, live for years without a written lease, but the landlord keeps accepting rent, and they would have the exact same protections as anybody else under this law.
Thank you.
Yes. Next.
Jasenia, did you have a question? I just saw your hand raised up again.
No, I think it was answered already.
Okay, cool.
This isn't in response to a question, but I want to say it before we move on, which is that like good cause in particular is an incredibly important tenant protection, because another way to say what it is basically it's the right to stay in your home and continue to have a lease even when your landlord doesn't like you. And that may seem very trivial, but if you are somebody who has a marginalized identity and your landlord does not, they may decide they don't like you for that reason. Or if you report repair issues in your building and ask the landlord to spend money to fix them, they might not like you. And very importantly, if you organize with other tenants in your building, your landlord might label you as a problem and decide that you need to go. And so to have a right to organize, to have a right to exist while marginalized in our homes, and to have a right to report issues without fear of retaliation, we need basic good cause protections that say, landlords, you cannot evict somebody without providing a valid legal reason to do it.
Thank you, Jen. I was snapping. So I'm gonna, if no one has any other thoughts or questions right here, and for sake of time, I'm gonna pass to Sami to move us through the messaging component, and then we're gonna move into practice. So please stick with us for the practice. And of course, like Jen was saying at the end, when there's some actions that folks can take. And if you do have any other thoughts or questions, maybe put them in the chat and we can answer them that way as we also move through this next part.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sam, and thank you, Jen. I'm just going to talk about how we fight this fight on multiple fronts, right? That we have the legislative and policy fight that we just talked about, right? That's the numbers, the facts, and the figures behind what motivates policy. But when we ask ourselves what really motivates us, like, why are you in this fight, right? When we really get to answering that question, no one is ever spouting off a percentage. No one is ever spouting off legislation, right? We talk about values, right? We talk about values that drive our connection to this issue, right? We talk about personal things. It could be no human being can be free unless they have safe and stable housing. It can be every human being has inherent dignity. It can be government needs to provide housing for people, right? It can, and you know, it's a lot of experiences too. A lot of us have interfaced with the housing system, and we know what it's like. We know what it's like to choose between paying rent and putting food on the table, right? That's what motivates this fight, right? And that's a story that we want to tell when we are lobbying and when we are fighting the legislative fight, right? So, and that's what we call a framing narrative, right? That's the stories that we tell about the issue, right? that there is one continuous narrative, or there are pieces that are pieced together that frames the conflict with values and offers an affirmative and positive vision, right? So we are trying to not just replace a system, we're also offering a vision. We're also offering something to be built toward, right? And to do that, we have to name a villain. We have to name the doer. We have to assign agency to the problem, right? There is someone who is causing this problem, right? There is a reason that the housing system is the way that it is. We want to name that. We want to do it justice and name it, right? And then we offer a message, we offer a vision that, again, re-articulates our values, right? And we're countering the opposition by using our own talking points, right? We're always trying to practice not repeating opposition talking points. We're always trying to practice our own talking points. Sam, if you go to the next slide. And I will read out the value statement. I'm going to have someone read out the agency statement, right? So the vision here is that everyone deserves guaranteed housing that is safe and dignified. And that can be articulated many ways, right? That can be, no one can be truly safe, or no one can be truly free without housing. And we know that to be true, right? We know we need housing to thrive. We know we need housing to survive. Can someone read the second paragraph for me?
I'll read it.
Thank you.
Corporate developers, predatory property owners, and some elected officials are keeping our communities stuck in a housing system that forces people to choose between paying rent and buying food. We have almost 100,000 homeless adults and children in New York. Unjust evictions, unfair rent hikes, and unsafe living conditions disproportionately affect Black and Brown people.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. And so what we did in that messaging is that we assigned agency to the problem, right? We led with a vision. We're assigning agency. We're saying there are people out there. We know them. We know who they are. We have elected officials that have the power to make change, and naming it is giving it is giving it power, right? Is giving us power. And we have stats. We have the numbers too on our side, but we have to couch them, and we have to discuss them and contextualize them within a broader vision statement, within a broader value statement, right? And that's why when we talk about what the policy fight that Jen was speaking about, we always want to start with these values, right? We always want to start with, okay, this is what's happening. This is what we believe should happen. Here is how our legislators and our representatives can help us and fight for us, right? That is how you effectively argue for our policy agenda. And with that, I'll pass it back to Sam.
Yeah, do folks have any questions around what Sami is sharing in terms of like how we share value and message with alongside of the policy before we move to practice? If not, then we will move right to practice. And we've got about 17 minutes left, and we'll spend probably like a good 10 to 12 of them practicing because we want to ensure that everybody here is at least getting a little bit more comfortable with the idea of lobbying and with getting our agenda across, our policy agenda across for next week's lobby sessions.